Hey there, my name is Zach Bernard. I'm the founder of WeFeaturePR. We are a leading podcast booking agency, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about why you are targeting the wrong podcasts when going about pitching. And the overall theme of this video is going to be about finding the right type of podcast, not just about the major numbers of listeners, downloads, or social followers, but finding the very niche podcast that will provide the most results for you and your business, as opposed to just vanity metrics. So a couple things that we will touch on: the audience size versus the engagement, very important. A lot of people are going to look at a social following of someone on like Instagram. They'll see they have 100,000 followers. You're like, wow, that's amazing. And then you look at the number of likes, the engagement they have, and then it's like 100 people. And then you're wondering, like, how does this person have 100,000 followers but 100 likes on their post? Sometimes those numbers can be inflated. So you want to be very careful to understand what a good podcast is. We're also going to cover how to identify podcasts that actually convert, the question that you should be asking yourself when considering a podcast, and then why smaller podcasts that are more niche will often outperform the larger size podcast. Before we dive into the video, make sure to drop a like, comment, subscribe, and feel free to head over to wefuture.com if you'd like to learn more about our company. And let's get right into it. So there's a couple vanity metric traps you're going to be very careful about. A lot of new people, when they get into the podcasting space, they look at a couple component, which is still a good metric to look at, but you want to go a little bit beyond that. The first one is most people are going to look strictly the number of review, the ranking, the number of episodes, and then based on that, they're going to make an assumption whether it is a good podcast. Don't get me wrong, that is something that you should factor in whenever you're doing your research, but you should also be factoring the social media following. Are they actually active? Are they sharing the episode whenever it goes live? And then also looking at the reviews themselves, because someone can have a lot of reviews, but it doesn't mean that they are good reviews. So you want to look at the reviews to make sure that there is good engagement, people like the show, and some reviews in some cases can even be fake. So you need to be very careful of that, to not associate your brand with a podcast that might be trying to like mislead listeners here. And the big question that you want to ask yourself is, would you rather speak to 500 distracted viewers, or would you rather speak to 50 people that are highly engaged and are action takers and might actually buy from you? I think it's a pretty straightforward answer. You probably will want to go for the 50 highly engaged listeners. So one thing to know as well is why download numbers lie. And out of transparency, if you're not very familiar with the podcasting space, download numbers are not something that's publicly available. The only way that you'll get access to that is if the podcast hosts tell you what those numbers are, if you pay them to go on their podcast, whether it's a sponsored appearance or anything like that, or you may use a tool like Graphic that may give you a guess, like an educated assumption of the download numbers. But be aware that those numbers are not factual by any means. We produce podcasts for clients, we have access to the behind the scenes, and we've compared based on the platform and the number of listeners they get, and it's totally off. So never base yourself strictly on that. Trust me, don't do that. One thing to keep in mind is if a podcast hits only like 100 downloads like weekly, it sounds like very low, but that number actually puts you in the like 25 top percent shows of all podcasts worldwide. So if you can just get to 100, you're in the top 25, and then as it goes on, you will get a high percentage. And another thing you have to keep in mind, going back to the explanation as far as a smaller podcast that's more niche is going to provide more value to you. So if your topic only interests like 10% in the entire world, but you have 7 people that listen to that, that's a near perfect podcast. You have 70% of your target addressable market that are listening to your podcast. Trust me, if you look at a business podcast, they're going to have maybe a lot of listeners, but a lot of them are not going to be your ideal client, prospect, customers, or anything like that. And also, the podcasting space is major. So in 2026, if my numbers are correct, and we double check this, so it should be, but there's around 4.66 million podcasts that are currently out there. Keep in mind, I believe it's like 80% of those are not actually active, they're not really posting, or they have like fewer than a couple episodes. So those are not really podcasts I would consider. Podcasts are competing for attention in 2026 everywhere. You want to be very careful about the podcasts that you do pitch. We have a rule ourselves at our company where we're not going to be pitching a podcast if it hasn't posted in the past 30 days, if it doesn't have a certain number of episodes, they don't have guests. We want to be very careful and intentional around the podcast that we pitch here. The number that matters isn't like the bigger total download numbers. It's how many of the right people are showing up. And there's a couple of ways that you can look at this to figure that out here. And with podcasting, there's really three main authority builder that you want to like keep in mind here. So you want to look at clicks versus connection. The clicks are great, but the connection is really what's going to drive the most result for your business, your company, etc. So podcasts themselves are a very good trust building asset. People are going to spend hours listening to you with a trusted voice during their commute, going to work, their workout, their daily routines, or anything like that. And if they're listening to you for hours and hours, they're much more likely to buy from you. The relationship as well, very important too. If someone listens to your podcast months and months and months, you're going to be creating trust really easily compared to impressions that really don't matter at the end of the day. And the influence, when a host recommends something, it's going to drive conversion because people have built a trust. They listen to them speak for hours and hours and for months. So they're going to be much more engaged. They're going to be much more willing to take action when a host gives you a recommendation saying like, hey, like we work with this company. They did an amazing job. Definitely recommend them to anyone that is looking for lead generation. So you want to be, again, very intentional, the podcast that you associate yourself with and the podcast that you do appear on. And again, finding the right podcast is so important. I'm going to go through a couple of statistics really quickly, but 55% of the listeners are going to trust the recommendations given by a favorite podcast host. They've listened to them. They know they're an expert. That's a very high number. If you look at a Facebook ad, most people are just going to scroll past it. They're going to think it's a scam if it's too good to be true. But if it comes from someone that you've listened to for a while, you get a recommendation, much more likely to trust it. It's like if you have a friend that gives you a referral, you're probably going to go with that referral as opposed to the Facebook ad that you saw online or the cold email outreach that you received. Fans, listeners are most likely to consider products or services that are recommended by their favorite hosts. And 44% of people will purchase after hearing an ad when it comes from a podcast advertising. If you compare that to any other channel, that is beyond amazing compared to any advertising channel. And 68% of people, they will tolerate an ad or they're not going to mind it if it comes from their favorite podcast host. It's like when you're waiting for the next song, you're driving your car, you're just going through it, waiting for the next song, and then there's a commercial that comes on. Most people, in my experience, are not the biggest fans of just like a radio station host, which is a bit different from podcast hosts. But if you have a podcast host that reads on a little like 30-second like read on, they're not going to mind that too much because you built this connection with this person after listening to them for months, for hours and hours, and you're going to tolerate that much more easily. So keep in mind in that whenever you're going on podcasts and if you promote, you talk about your services or anything like that, people, because you're associating yourself with that host, they're going to be much more willing to hear you as opposed to being completely turned off. So there's a couple ways to find the action-taking podcast. And this is very important because a lot of people are going to look at any type of podcast. You're like, hey, like let's get on those shows. This is great. There's really, I would say like three main ways that you want to look to see if a podcast has an action-taking audience. The first one is if the host is selling anything. Are they selling a course, mastermind, consulting, or anything? And if that host is successful in monetizing their audience, it proves that their audience is actually spending money based on trust, which means if you go on their podcast, that host is giving you their platform, it will happen as well. Another very important, a loyal social following. So if you look at the social media of the host, is that audience very active? Are they engaging? Are they participating? Another good way to check is like look at the events. If they have any events they're selling, if they have a community, is that being all like sold out? Like they have a big community audience that's paying a fee. That shows again, the host is selling something, people engaging, they're paying for it because they value what their host has to offer. Like they have that trust built in them. And then that's going to be portrayed on you whenever you go on their podcast. And then you also want to look at the niche specifically, because if you look at a podcast around business and entrepreneurship, and then you compare to scaling a service business past 7 figures, being more specific will always go better in any scenario. Because if I look at a podcast, I'm looking to learn something very specific to my specific situation, I'm probably going to trust more the person that is directly in that space, that's helping maybe those specific people, versus someone that runs a general business podcast and is giving advice that is pretty generic. Could work with anyone, but it's not specific to you. So very important as well. Try to find the podcasts that are very specific to you. It will provide more value. And there's 5 main questions that you should be asking yourself before pitching. Before you even take the time to craft a pitch, you want to ask those 5 questions. The first one, who exactly is listening, not just business owners. Again, you want to go about very specific, the stage, their frustration, their pain points, their needs. You want to figure out exactly who that is. You basically want to create a guest an audience profile, And you also want to figure out if that podcast has featured other people in your space. Is the audience excited, or have they seen that same topic 20 times and they cannot take it anymore? You're going to be very careful about that. Too many of the same guests talking about the exact same thing is going to be much less appealing to anyone listening to the podcast, and they're not going to be action takers on that because they've heard it so many times. And then you also want to see, does the audience actually have a problem that you can solve right now? And that's very important, because if you're on a podcast, the audience doesn't have that pain point, you're wasting your time. Making sure that it is a good podcast host. So this is one thing that a lot of people skip over, but is the podcast a good person? Are they sharing the podcast on social? Are they promoting it? And do they genuinely vibe with your message? Like, are they promoting the podcast effectively? Do they like you as a person? Do people like them? I mean, a good way to look at that is look at the reviews. Are people saying good things about them? If not, then I'd probably avoid that podcast. And then your call to action. You want to know what happens after the episode. You want to know your call to action, your landing page, and follow-up strategy. And you want to make sure that this will appeal with that podcast host. For example, if this podcast host that you want to pitch doesn't let you promote yourself, they don't add your call to action, the show notes, it's probably not a very good podcast to pitch. You're going to waste your time. You're going to go on that show without any call to action. You're not sending listeners to anywhere that could benefit you. And the reason why smaller audiences win is people that are very in a very more niche space. You're going to be more engaged compared to a very more broad entrepreneurship podcast, half interested person, as mentioned. So niche podcasts essentially build reference points in specific industries. They're creating that authority that a lot of the more general content cannot match. And a good example of that, which was actually really interesting, we had one of our clients that went on a dental specific podcast. Believe it or not, there are podcasts specific to the dental space. And our client went on that show. The podcast wasn't even published yet. And he created a partnership directly with the host's wife, if I recall correctly. And that was a 5-figure deal in revenue. Just out of going on a very niche industry specific podcast. And just by having something that was relevant to the podcast host and his audience, he was able to create a partnership just like that. And yeah, podcast wasn't even published and he got that value, which is pretty crazy. So a little recap, stop chasing numbers and start building trust. You want to find the right rooms, the right podcasts, match your message to the podcasts that do make sense, and look to build long-term authority. Do not play this as a short-term game, trying to get on every single podcast. Even if they're not relevant to you, you're just going to waste your time. It's going to affect your brand, your reputation. Podcast guesting can be one of the best ways to build your business, only if you do strategically. Again, my name is Zach Bernard. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm the founder of WeFeature PR. Over time, we've booked over 1,500 podcast appearances for clients, leveraging your networks of 600 to 700 podcast hosts that we collaborate with on a daily basis. If you want to skip the entire process of trying to pitch yourself and get on podcasts yourself, go to wefeature.com. There's going to be a little button here to book a call, and we'll talk to you soon.